many are asking, how do they refute the constant conflation when they're struggling or fighting for justice in Palestine with anti-Semitism? And then what do you say to Jews, like Jewish activists, especially anti-Zionist Jewish activists, who are accused of self-hate or betrayal? These are some of the questions that we're getting.
Very important.
So I'm sure you've come up with these questions many times. You've heard these questions many times.
Yeah, but they are important. For the first question, I think that in accusations like these and allegations like this, that when you support the Palestinians or when you criticize Zionism as racism, you are an anti-Semite, it's very important to control the conversation. Rather than be defensive, is telling people, and I'm serious about it, and I do it as much as I can, by telling them you're probably, I can do it in a polite way and not in an impolite way. In a polite way, I say, you probably don't know enough about the history of Zionism and Judaism. In an impolite way, I say, you're an imbecile who doesn't know anything about the history. So it depends. And this is when I said sound bites don't work here, because really you have to explain the difference between faith and ideology. It's amazing when it comes to the Islamic State, people are very intelligent. They say, oh yes, this is ideology and this is religion. When it comes to white supremacy in the United States, people say, of course, this is not Christianity, this is an ideology that uses Christianity. Somehow, when it comes to supremacist, racist, Jewish ideology, it means that if you say that, then you're anti-Semite. You're not an anti-Christian when you are against the Aryan nation, and you're not anti-Islamic if you don't like the Islamic State. And the same is true about Zionism. So that's one point I would say, and I mean by controlling the conversation, by saying, let me explain to you the difference between religion and ideology, and what happens when ideology uses religion for its political ambition. So I think that's very important to make sure that you know that history, even in a cursory way, so you can easily shift the conversation to the lack of knowledge of those who accuse you. As for self-hating, I don't know. Maybe it's my idiosyncratic nature. It always amuses me, I must say. It amuses me. I remember the first time I heard it really strong was in Cleveland, Ohio. I was talking there in the club. I don't remember the name of the club, and half of the audience were Zionist Jews and Christians, and half were Palestinians. And for some reason, were all physicians and doctors. And most of the Palestinians in Cleveland are doctors. I don't know why, but they're all doctors. And the rabbi of Cleveland said, I don't know how you live with yourself as a self-hating Jew. And I said, wait a minute, you know, I have many Palestinian doctors friends here, and I went to all their clinics, and I'm afraid to tell you that they told me that this disease is incurable. Probably the self-hate, there's no pill against it, there's no vaccination against it. So I said to him, you're right, I would live with this. Some people live with chronic disease and make it. So yeah, I think this whole idea is so absurd. You should ridicule it rather than seriously tackle it.
So, thank you, Ilan. So there are several questions about Hamas, as you can imagine. And among the questions about Hamas is, given what you've said about the Western world, the post-World War II sort of construction of Western morality, which on the one hand proclaims all these liberal values, on the other hand, of course, either doesn't apply them or actually goes into extreme violence and justifies it, as we see now with Gaza. So when Islamist movements like Hamas or Hezbollah or other movements, or Iran for that matter, the Iranian revolutionary government, when they carry out and they say, look, there's no point putting our faith in the West or in these so-called universal values of the West, because they've never once been used to or have never been implemented properly. They've always been sort of ignored. So how do you, and given the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah and others are actually putting, they're the ones doing the fighting. They're the ones. How do you sort of how do you deal with that? Because they don't actually offer necessarily the universal secular vision of a state that you see as a future. How do you square that contradiction?
Yeah,
or deal with that contradiction?
absolutely. I think it's an important question. It's very clear that the way Western imperialism, and I include in this Zionism, introduce the so-called universal values of human rights and civil rights to places such as the Arab world were manipulative, were discriminatory, were motivated sometimes by capitalist interest and imperialist interest, and almost the ultimate example for this kind of introduction was trying to bomb Iraq into democracy. And that definitely, you understand why a lot of people in the Arab world would say democracy is overrated. Because democracy for us is imperialism, is occupation, is colonialism, and not surprising, in the moments where secular westernized ideologies fail to deliver the goods, people go somewhere else. That's not surprising. It's very human to do that. That doesn't mean that the Arab world, by the way, for that matter, the world at large, has resolved the kind of dialectical relations secular people will have to have with religious people. It doesn't mean that we are, as a human society, not just in the Arab world, have found the universal moral foundation to such an extent that we know exactly who has the high moral ground and who doesn't. I'm not a moral relativist. I don't mean by that every morality is fine. I'm not a postmodernist. And so I'm just saying that societies, unlike the Western idea of solution, there is a non-Western idea of solution. In Islam, for instance, even in pre-Islamic societies, people were looking for consensus rather than a majority vote. And consensuses, and you wrote about it also in your book, sometimes you live and let live without solving all the differences in the way you perceive the world in moral terms and ideological terms even. It's the kind of live and let live dialogical, not dialectical, dialogical reality in which you can live. Now, I do think that people, and we know the Arab world, we know the societies very well and intimately. There were long periods in history where they were able to do this. And it was usually external intervention that turned the idea of a sectarian society into something negative rather than a mosaic of people with different collective identities. And the same is true about Palestine. In other words, what I'm trying to say here, that I don't think the Hamas and Hezbollah necessarily represent the vision of the future of the Arab world or Palestine, even in the way that they visualize it. What they are getting from the people is their resilience and is their courage and resistance. I don't think that people are blind to, I don't think people are blind to their part of their theocratic envision of the future. I don't think people who respect the position, let's say, of Syria or Iran, in where the whole Arab world was queuing in, wanting to normalize relations with Israel, that people did not feel, on the one hand said, this is a courageous position to be in. It didn't mean that they were blind to the violation of human rights, either in Syria or in Iran. As human beings, we can juggle both poles. We can juggle these moral questions in a more complex way. We can say exactly what we admire, and we say exactly what we don't accept, and we can build together a mechanism by which to have this dialogue. And this dialogue between modernity and tradition, religion, secularism, is not just an issue of the Arab world. It's the issue of Europe. It's the issue of the United States. We kind of, we sort of were mesmerized by this Western world, this kind of democratic world. And then you sort of forget about the fact that many more people are executed in the United States than anywhere in the world. This is not talked about. That the American electoral system is one of the most antiquated, non-democratic election that that can bring someone like Trump to the highest position in the country. All these things need to be reopened.
Okay. But there's still this question that there seems to be two different tracks of resistance. And this is from some of the questions coming out here. One is you just referred to Hamas and Hezbollah and the Islamist resistance. You know, irrespective of what people think of them, good or bad, but they're the ones who are actually, as you said, they're confronting the normalization process, and that's a very specific discourse that they apply. They don't sort of pretend, they don't address like Western sort of liberal values, because they've seen the hypocrisy there. They do their own thing, and you said there's a theocratic element, there's a religious element, there's all these things. How do you reconcile that reality there with the fact that here, where students are advocating, and faculty and staff, yourself today in your lecture, are advocating for sort of civil, secular, justice.
Yeah.
That's how these are two separate tracks. How do you see them? Do you see them as contradictions, or do you see them as eventually sort of converging at some point?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think what you are doing, if you look at the history of successful anti-colonialist struggles, not just anti-colonialist struggles in history against oppression by powerful political structures, they were always achieved by a coalition between forces that did not agree about everything, that had different stance on moral issues, ideological issues, maybe even vision. You also have the opposite examples. Think about Weimar Germany, that the Social Democrats and the communists refused to collaborate in bringing down Nazism because they felt that they don't see the future exactly the same, which really allowed the Nazi forces to come to power in Germany. This is where I think they converge. It is now the alliance of the people who work together in order to prevent the elimination of the Palestinian people. You are not going to be to do fine-tuning. If I'm right, and we are in an existential struggle to prevent the genocide of the Palestinian people, then I don't have the luxury of getting into arguments about what would happen in Palestine once we succeed to stop the genocide.